The first time I ever heard my mother say I was her pride, I must have been 7. I was sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, coloring in the wide-eyed princesses of a cheap fairy tale book, when she answered the phone and told whoever was on the other end, "My daughter is my pride. Everything I do is for her." Her voice had this particular softness, the kind she saved for strangers, as though the world deserved to see a mother who adored her child. I remember pausing my crayon pressed too hard against the paper, smudging the edges of the gown I was filling in pink. Pride. The word lingered like a ribbon of light around my small body, wrapping me in warmth I didn't always feel from her directly. She could be cold, at times sharp when I disappointed her, but that one overheard sentence was enough to anchor my little heart for years. I believed it. I wanted to believe it more than anything. Now I am 35 years old, and I can tell you with a trembling honesty, I wish weren't mine. Those words were never meant for me. Not truly. Pride was a costume my mother wore in public, one she draped herself in when eyes were on her, when people needed to see her as nurturing, as noble, as someone whose life revolved around her child. Behind closed doors, pride turned into pressure, into comparison, into long silences when I failed to meet the standard she believed would make her look better. And yet, for most of my life, I carried her words like a charm around my neck. I loved her with a ferocity that blinds children from recognizing betrayal, even when it is painted in front of them in thick black strokes. I grew up in a house that smelled of lemon polish and secrets. My father was the kind of man who carried exhaustion in his shoulders, always bent as if the world had him pressed down. He loved me, but he also feared my mother in the way many men fear a woman who has the power to expose their soft underbelly. My older brother Daniel was 3 years my senior, and the apple of her eye, though she swore otherwise. She would tell anyone who asked that she loved us both equally, that we were her 2 shining stars. But the truth glared at me every time she saved the larger slice of pie for him, every time she excused his mistakes with a weary sigh while cataloging mine with sharp precision. Still, I fought for her approval the way a drowning person fights for air. I earned grades that made teachers call home. I won little medals at school that I polished until they reflected light back at me. I thought maybe if I shined brightly enough, I would catch her attention the way Daniel did effortlessly just by existing. When she told me I was her pride, I repeated it in my head like a prayer, as though those words could erase the loneliness that crept in whenever I watched her stroke his hair with a tenderness she rarely offered me. By the time I reached adulthood, I had woven my life around pleasing her. I became a teacher, like she once dreamed of being, but never pursued. I stayed close to home, declining job offers that would have taken me out of state, telling myself it was because I wanted to help take care of her as she aged. But deep down, it was because I still believed, if I stayed, she might finally see me. I didn't realize that my loyalty would one day become the noose she tightened around my neck in front of strangers, in a room where truth and lies stood side by side waiting for judgment. The courtroom. Even the word chills me now. The way the air felt in their cold, sterile, carrying the faint scent of paper and polish, contrasted so cruelly with the heat in my chest the day my life unraveled. I never imagined my mother would stand on the other side, her voice calm, her words cutting me deeper than any enemy's blade. I never imagined she would call the man who had betrayed me family, while I sat shaking, trying to remember how to breathe. But to explain how we reached that moment, I need to go back further to the beginning of the fractures that eventually split us wide open. It started with Daniel. Of course it did. He was always the center, the storm, the golden boy, who could do no wrong. When we were children, his mischief was labeled "boys will be boys," while my mistakes were engraved in stone. As we grew older, his recklessness turned to something sharper, Gambling debts, shady friends, secrets whispered into late-night phone calls. I saw it, I tried to warn her, but she only shook her head and said, "He's just going through a phase." My mother's denial was a wall I couldn't break through, no matter how loudly I knocked. The day Daniel stole from me, something inside me cracked. I had been saving for years, tucking away bits of my salary in a small account I never spoke of. It was my escape fund, my dream of one day buying a little house with a garden where I could finally breathe without feeling her shadow over me. When I discovered the account had been drained, my first thought was of some banking error. But the truth arrived in the form of a crumpled receipt I found shoved in the pocket of his jacket, my name scrawled in the corner, his signature scrawled underneath. He had taken everything. When I confronted him, he didn't even look ashamed. He told me he needed it, that I should understand, that family helps family. My hands shook as I asked how he could do this to me, how he could strip me of the one thing I had built on my own. He just shrugged his eyes cold and said, "You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." Those words became the poison in my veins, feeding the rage that grew inside me. I thought my mother would stand with me. I thought she would finally see the difference between us, the betrayal he had committed, the pain carved into my chest. But when I told her, she looked at me with that same sharpness I had known my whole life and asked why I hadn't been more careful. She said Daniel was struggling, that he needed help, that money could be replaced, but brothers could not. I remember staring at her, my vision blurring with tears, and whispering, "What about me? Can I be replaced too?" She didn't answer. She didn't need to. That silence became the wound I carried into the courtroom years later when everything came to a head. By then, Daniel's debts had grown monstrous, and his desperate attempts to escape them had dragged me into a web of lies I didn't weave. He forged documents with my name-signed contracts that bound me to responsibilities I never agreed to, and when the creditors came knocking, they came for me. I can still see their faces, the men in dark suits who stood on my porch with papers in hand, telling me I owed money I had never touched. I fought, of course, I fought. I gathered evidence, I hired a lawyer, I prepared myself to expose every rotten thing he had done. I told myself this time, my mother would see the truth. She would stand beside me and say enough. She would finally be my pride in action, not just in words. But when the day came, when the gavel echoed in that courtroom and eyes turned to the witness stand, it was her voice I heard speaking against me. Calm, clear, choosing him over me. She said I had always been unstable, too emotional, prone to exaggeration. She painted me as reckless, as careless, as someone who couldn't possibly manage money. She called Daniel responsible, misunderstood, a victim of circumstance. Each word from her mouth was a blade carving me open, in front of strangers stripping me bare, until I was nothing but a woman begging the court to believe her against her own mother. And they didn't. They believed her. I remember gripping the edge of the table, my nails digging into the wood until they split. I remember looking at her, at the woman who had once told me I was her pride, and realizing I had been nothing more than her shield, her story to tell her reflection when it suited her. She never loved me the way I thought she did. She loved the way I made her look, the way I held myself together, even when she tore me apart. And in that moment, as my brother smirked from across the room, and my mother clasped his hand as though he were the wronged one, I felt something inside me die. But the thing about death is that it makes room for rebirth. And as I sat there humiliated, betrayed, broken beyond recognition, another part of me began to stir. A part that had waited years for the chance to rise. the part that whispered, "If they want war, then war is what they will have." I walked out of that courthouse with the weight of defeat pressing on my chest, but beneath it, a strange fire flickered. The sun outside felt too bright for the ruin I carried inside me, and I remember squinting, blinking back tears that threatened to blind me completely. My lawyer said something about appeals, about options still left, but I barely heard him. My ears were still ringing with my mother's voice, her calm testimony, her betrayal dressed as reason. She had not just chosen Daniel over me. She had chosen to erase me, to paint me as a caricature of weakness, someone who didn't deserve to be heard. I drove home in silence, the world outside my window, a blur of color and motion. Inside, I was hollow. Yet in that emptiness, rage began to bloom like a poisonous flower. For years, I had swallowed my anger, folded it neatly inside me like linens tucked away in a drawer. I had told myself to be patient, to forgive, to try harder. That day, I realized patience had been my prison. Forgiveness had been the rope tied around my throat. They had mistaken my silence for weakness, and in doing so, they gave me the strength to rise in a way they would never expect. At home, I pulled out the box I had kept hidden at the back of my closet. It was full of documents, bank statements, old letters, receipts, little fragments of evidence I had collected over the years. Proof of Daniel's gambling, his loans, his thefts. I had gathered them out of desperation, once thinking I could confront him with facts, make him change. Now I understood what their real purpose was. They were weapons. Every paper, every slip, every signature he had scribbled carelessly, they were the sharp edges of the blade I would turn against him. But revenge is never simple. It seeps into your veins and demands more than just action. It demands patience, calculation, the willingness to sacrifice parts of yourself. I spent nights hunched over my kitchen table, piecing together timelines, tracing connections, finding the cracks in his lies. I discovered not just the debts he owed, but the people he owed them to, the kinds of men who didn't forgive, who didn't forget. Men who would burn down his life without a second thought if the right spark touched their fuse. And here is the truth I wrestle with even now. I did not stop that spark. I could have. I could have shielded him, warned him, protected him the way I once begged him to protect me. Instead, I stepped aside and let the fire spread. Some would say I orchestrated it, that I guided the flame with careful hands. Maybe I did, but I told myself then, and still tell myself now, that all I did was let karma do its work. The first crack in their facade came quietly. A business partner of Daniel's, a man with eyes like steel and hands scarred from work I didn't want to imagine, came knocking at his door. I wasn't there, but I heard about it from the neighbors, whispers drifting back to me like smoke. Voices raised threats, hissed Daniel's arrogance, colliding with the kind of danger you don't laugh off. He had borrowed money, promised returns that never came, and now they wanted their due. I watched from the sidelines as his perfect image began to crumble. Mother still clung to her delusions, telling anyone who would listen that he was misunderstood, that the world was cruel to her poor boy. But even her words began to falter when bills piled up, when men started calling the house late at night, their voices heavy with menace. I remember one evening sitting alone at my kitchen table, hearing her leave a message on my voicemail. Her voice trembled as she asked if I had heard from Daniel, if I could maybe lend a little money to help him out of a tight spot. I replayed that message 3 times, savoring it like a bitter wine. My mother, who had sworn under oath that I was irresponsible, who had painted me as careless with money, now asking me to save her son. I didn't call her back. Instead, I leaned into the silence. I let them scramble, let them feel the cold edge of fear I had lived with for years. I told myself it wasn't revenge, it was balance, it was justice. But in the dark, when sleep wouldn't come, I admitted the truth. I wanted them to suffer. I wanted my mother to know what it felt like to stand by someone and be betrayed, to realize too late that her loyalty had been a mistake. The breaking point came one night when I received a frantic call from Daniel himself. His voice was ragged, frantic, stripped of the arrogance he usually carried like armor. "I need your help." He said the words tumbling out so fast they almost tripped over each other. "Please, they're after me. I don't know where to go." For a moment, the little sister in me stirred. The girl who had once begged for his approval, who had once believed we could be a family, almost reached through the phone to pull him to safety. But then, I remembered the courtroom, my mother's voice, his smirk, the way they had left me drowning alone while they clung to each other. I closed my eyes and said, "I can't help you." Then I hung up. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. My hands shook, my heart raced, but beneath the guilt was a dark sense of release. I had chosen myself. For the first time, I had put my survival above their chaos. Within weeks, it all collapsed. Daniel's creditors dragged his name through the mud lawsuits piled up, and the fragile mask my mother had worn for years shattered in front of everyone. She stopped calling me then, too proud to admit she needed me, too broken to face the truth. I heard from others, neighbors, distant relatives, about her decline. The woman who once stood tall in courtrooms, her voice steady and condemning, now sat in her kitchen surrounded by unpaid bills and unanswered questions. And me, I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated watching their empire of lies crumble. Instead, I felt empty. Revenge, I learned, does not heal wounds. It only mirrors them back at you. I had destroyed them, yes, but in the process, I had destroyed pieces of myself too. One night, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside, and I pulled out that old coloring book I had kept all these years. The princesses were faded now, their gowns smeared by the clumsy hands of a little girl who once believed her mother's words. I traced the lines with my fingers and whispered to that child, "You deserved better." My voice cracked, and for the first time in years, I let myself cry, not for them, but for me. That was when I realized my revenge was incomplete. It wasn't enough to watch them fall. I needed to reclaim myself, to rise beyond the ashes of their betrayal. I needed to rewrite the story that had been written for me in lies and silence. And so I began to plan not for their destruction, but for my rebirth. Rebirth is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive like a sunrise, neat and golden, spilling light all at once. It comes in fragments, in small sparks that feel almost accidental at first. For me, it began the morning I stood in front of the mirror, still puffy-eyed from another sleepless night, and said out loud, "You are not what they called you." My voice trembled. The words sounded foreign, but I repeated them anyway, until the sound of them began to carve a crack in the wall of shame that had kept me caged for years. I was 36, and I had spent nearly every year of my life defining myself by my mother's approval. Every choice I made, career, relationships, even the clothes I wore, was filtered through the invisible question, would she be proud? But after the courtroom, after the betrayal, I realized I had been asking the wrong question all along. The real one was this: would I be proud? And for the first time, I wanted the answer to be yes. So I began with small things. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since college. My brushes were stiff with neglect. My colors dried at the edges, but the act of dragging pigment across canvas felt like breathing new air into lungs that had long been starved. I painted my pain first, dark strokes, violent clashes of red and black, and then slowly I painted softer things, a field of lavender. A window cracked open to a dawn sky, a girl's silhouette standing alone but unbroken. At night, when guilt threatened to suffocate me, guilt for letting Daniel fall, guilt for not rescuing my mother, I turned to my journals. I wrote until my hand cramped, until ink bled through pages, until the tangled knot inside me loosened just enough to let me sleep. The more I wrote, the more I uncovered truths I had buried under years of obedience. My mother's love had always been conditional. My brother's cruelty had been sharpened by her favoritism. And me, I had played the role of scapegoat, the one who carried the blame, so they didn't have to. But rebirth is not only about self-discovery, it is also about reckoning. And reckoning came in the form of a letter. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I found the envelope wedged beneath my apartment door. No return address, but I knew the handwriting immediately. My mother's. My chest tightened as I tore it open, my hands trembling like they had that day in the courtroom. The letter was short, her words careful but raw. She wrote that Daniel was gone, vanished into the shadows of his debts, unreachable. She confessed that her health was failing, that the house was too quiet, too heavy with ghosts. And then, at the bottom, she wrote, "You are always stronger than I admitted. Please forgive me before it's too late. Forgive." The word scraped against my skin like glass. I stared at it for a long time, my heart a storm of fury and longing. For so long, I had wanted her to admit the truth. And now, here it was, scribbled on a page that reeked of desperation. But forgiveness is not a switch you can flip. It is a wound that has to be tended slowly, carefully until scar tissue forms. I didn't respond immediately. I folded the letter back into its envelope and tucked it into the drawer of my nightstand. Some nights, I would pull it out, read it again, my emotions swinging between rage and grief-love and loathing. Other nights, I would slam the drawer shut and vow never to look at it again. But no matter what I told myself, it remained there whispering at me like a restless ghost. Weeks passed before I finally drove to her house. The place I had once called home looked smaller, shabbier, its paint peeling like old skin. My heart pounded as I stood on the porch, my hand hovering over the doorknob. When she opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. My mother, once so sharp, so commanding, looked frail, her face lined with regret, her shoulders sagging under invisible weight. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. I expected her to speak first, but she didn't. It was me who whispered, "Why did you do it?" My voice cracked the years of silence behind it, breaking open like a dam. She looked down at her hands, twisting them together, and said, "Because I was afraid of losing him. And in trying to hold on to him, I lost you." Her honesty cut deeper than her lies ever had. I wanted to scream, to throw every memory of betrayal back in her face, but the sound caught in my throat. Instead, I let the silence stretch between us, heavy and suffocating. And in that silence, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't about excusing her. It wasn't about erasing what she had done. It was about releasing myself from the chains of her choices. "I can't forget," I said finally, my voice steadier now. "But I don't want to carry this anymore. Not for you. For me." Her eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in my life, I saw her not as a towering figure of judgment, but as a woman, flawed, broken, scared. And in that moment, I understood that her betrayal said more about her than it ever did about me. The weeks that followed were fragile. We spoke cautiously, like people learning a new language. Sometimes we fought, sometimes we laughed, sometimes we sat in silence. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was something. A beginning. And yet there remained the shadow of Daniel. His absence was a wound we both carried differently. For her, it was grief tangled with denial. For me, it was freedom tangled with guilt. I didn't know if he was alive or dead, if he blamed me, or forgot me altogether. But I knew this: if he ever returned, I would not be the same sister who once begged for scraps of his love. Because now I knew who I was. One evening, as I packed up canvases for a small local art show, a show I had organized myself, something I never would have dared before I caught my reflection in the mirror. For the first time, I didn't see a woman defined by betrayal. I saw someone who had clawed her way out of the fire, scarred but standing. And then it happened. The call. It was late, the sky outside thick with rain, when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. My stomach clenched as I answered, and a voice I hadn't heard in years rasped through the line. "It's me. I need you, Daniel." The world tilted my knees, weakening. His voice was thin, desperate, stripped of all arrogance. He said he was in trouble again, worse than before. He said I was the only one he could trust. The irony of it nearly made me laugh, bitter and sharp. After everything, after the courtroom, after the lies, after the ruin, he still thought I would save him. And in that moment, standing in my small apartment with rain streaking the windows, I realized my rebirth was about to face its greatest test. The sound of his voice lingered in the room long after the call ended, as though it had seeped into the walls, staining them with old memories I had fought so hard to scrub clean. I stood there, phone clutched in my hand, my reflection blurred in the rain-streaked glass of the window. My brother, my betrayer, my blood. For years I had prayed he would call, that he would one day admit what he had done to me, beg forgiveness, offer something that resembled remorse. But this call was not that. It was another plea, another rope thrown toward me with the expectation that I would pull him from the pit he had dug. For a long time, I just stood frozen, torn between instinct and resolve. The instinct was the old voice, the little sister still desperate for a family, whispering, "Help him. Save him. Maybe then he'll love you." But the resolve was louder now, steadier. It said, "He will never change, and you have already sacrificed too much." I didn't answer him right away. I let the voicemail play out, his voice cracking, as he said he was out of money, that men were after him, that he had no one else. When the message ended, I placed my phone on the table and sat down slowly, feeling the tremor in my hands. It was then that I realized the true nature of revenge. Revenge is not always loud. It does not always come with fire or shattered glass. Sometimes it is the quietest act in the world, the refusal to be broken again. I spent that night staring at the ceiling, my mind a battlefield. I thought of the courtroom, of my mother's voice trembling as she testified against me, of Daniel's smirk, as if he had already won. I thought of the nights I cried myself to sleep, of the years I had built myself from the rubble of their betrayal. And then I thought of that little girl with the coloring book, the one who once believed her mother when she said she was her pride. That little girl deserved better. When the sun rose soft and pink against the horizon, I made my choice. I did not call him back. I did not go rushing into the storm he had created. Instead, I picked up my paintbrush and began a new canvas. At the center, I painted a woman standing on a bridge, flames behind her, water beneath her, the sky opening wide above. She was not reaching back. She was moving forward. Days later, my mother called. Her voice was weak-threaded, with a fear I had never heard before. "He's gone," she whispered. "Daniel. They say he's gone. There are moments in life that split you in two, and that was one of them." A part of me shattered at the thought that my brother, flesh of my flesh, might be dead, consumed by the very demons he had fed for so long. But another part of me felt an odd stillness, as though the storm that had raged in me for decades had finally burned itself out. I went to my mother's house that evening. She sat in the living room surrounded by silence, so heavy it pressed against my skin. She looked at me with eyes full of grief, of regret, of unspoken apologies. For once, there was no sharpness in her tone, no judgment. She was simply a mother who had lost her son. We didn't speak much that night. We just sat together, the distance between us bridged by something greater than words. For the first time, I felt no need to prove myself to her. I was not her pride. I was not her disappointment. I was simply me, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I learned to live with the paradox of grief and freedom. I mourned the brother I never truly had, even as I celebrated the woman I had become without him. I cared for my mother in small ways, not out of duty, but out of choice. I visited when I could, brought her meals, listened when she spoke of the past. I never told her the full truth, that I had let him fall, that I had chosen silence instead of rescue, but perhaps she already knew. The art show came and went. People stood before my canvases, eyes glistening, voices hushed. They asked about the stories behind the colors, the shapes, the figures. And I told them honestly that they were pieces of my life, fragments of a journey through betrayal, rage, and rebirth. For the first time, I felt seen, not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as myself. One evening, after the gallery closed, I walked outside and looked at the sky. The air was cool, the stars scattered like promises across the darkness. And in that quiet, I understood the lesson life had carved into me with all its sharp edges. Betrayal may break you, but it also frees you. It forces you to see who you are without the masks others place on you. Revenge may bring satisfaction, but true power lies in choosing yourself again and again, no matter who tries to silence you. I thought of my mother's words from long ago, the ones I had carried like a charm around my neck. My daughter is my pride. They no longer hurt me. They no longer bound me, because now I didn't need her pride. I had my own, and that is where I will leave you with this truth. Your worth is not defined by who stands beside you in courtrooms, or who whispers your name with love or with venom. Your worth is yours alone, unshakable, unbreakable, waiting for you to claim it. If my story has touched something inside you, if you've ever felt betrayed, silenced, or unseen, know this: you are stronger than you realize. And you don't need anyone's permission to rise. If this story meant something to you, please like, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment below sharing your own journey. Maybe your words will be the lifeline someone else needs tonight.